Welcome back, y'all. We're in the inner room now, the space where we don't begin by pointing fingers at the world around us, because we begin by looking inward. When we're asking what is happening within our own hearts and mind, because most of the conflict we see today did not begin with hatred. It definitely began with misunderstanding, and somewhere along the way, pride stepped in, and it definitely convinced us that listening was optional. Now, today, I want to talk about something that nearly every single one of us experience, but very few of us actually take the time to examine honestly. So, I'm gonna ask y'all this: why does it feel like everyone's offended right now? But I'm gonna ask you the second part is anybody actually listening? The truth of the matter is, we live in the most connected generation in human history. We have access to more information, more videos, and way more perspectives than ever before. And yet, we still have division. It just gets bigger and bigger. We only hear half of a sentence. We read a headline without any type of context. We watch short clips that's stripped of nuance, and then we react. But it's never to understand. It's never to clarify. But we respond so quickly, as quickly as we possibly can. And it seems to me that offense has become our reflex. But here's the question we rarely stop to ask ourselves: are we truly being harmed, or are we simply just uncomfortable? Because discomfort feels dangerous when our identity is fragile. And when our identity feels fragile, listening can feel like losing ground. Now, let me be very clear about something. Real harm does exist. Abuse does exist. Oppression does exist. Injustices exist. Acknowledging those things, that's not weakness, and it's not negotiable. But I am inclined to say, not every emotion, no reaction is trauma. Not every disagreement is violence. And not every challenge to our thinking is disrespect. Sometimes we label being offended when it's actually we're just being confronted. And confrontation, when it is rooted in truth and care, that's an invitation to grow. Growth, however, it does require humility. Here's the trick, y'all. Humility always begins when we listen. That's how it starts. And the truth is, many of us have stopped listening because listening forces us to admit that we might not have the full picture. It doesn't give us all the clicks, all the likes, all the shares. And admitting that right there threatens our egos. We have been trained by culture and social media to react faster than we reflect, to speak louder instead of thinking deeper, to win arguments rather than to understand people. But wisdom does not come from volume. Wisdom comes from discernment. And if y'all understand this, one thing I want to leave with y'all is discernment requires silence. And that's why here in the inner room, to turn that mirror on ourselves. Because labeling someone ignorant, before writing them off entirely, ask yourself this honestly. Am I listening to understand, or am I listening only to respond? Because one option builds bridges and the other option is building a wall. Most people do not want to be heard simply so they can be right. They want to be heard so they can be seen. Now, from a faith perspective, scripture reminds us to be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry. Not because silence is weakness, but because self-control is strength. Just from that clip alone, are we actually listening and actually thinking about what we need to say before we actually say it? Jesus listened even to those who disagreed with him. Jesus asked questions. Jesus discerned hearts. Jesus spoke truth, but he did so with wisdom and intention. And from this perspective, scripture speaks directly to what we're living through right now. James 1:19 and 20, we read, everyone should be quick to listen, slow to speak, and slow to become angry, because human anger does not produce the righteousness that God desires. That verse is not about silence for the sake of silence. It's about discipline. It's a reminder that reacting without reflection often pulls us away from wisdom, not closer to it. Another scripture reference, Proverbs 18:2, says, a fool takes no pleasure in understanding, but only in expressing his opinion. In other words, wisdom isn't found in being the loudest person in the room. It's found in seeking understanding before speaking. We have all these commentators and all these podcasters, all these TikTokers, all these YouTubers, all these influencers that from their persona and their personality, they are loud. It could be a character, part of their persona and how they make their edge in this industry. But just because there's a loudest in the room doesn't always make them right. It doesn't make them wrong. Let me make that very clear. But there is a balance because even Jesus modeled this posture of not being the loudest in the room. Throughout the gospel, we see Jesus asking questions before correcting. He listened before responding. He discerned hearts, not just arguments. And scripture always reminds us why this matters. Like in 1 Samuel 16:7, it says, people look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. That includes our tone, that includes our motives, and that includes how quickly we become offended. Truth without love becomes noise. Love without truth becomes enabling. But listening is where both of them meet. Listening is not agreement. Listening is not a surrender. Listening, however, is obedience to wisdom. Truth without love becomes noise. So here's the invitation for this week. Before you react, pause. Before you speak, listen. Before you judge, take a moment to examine your heart, because the loudest voice in the room is rarely the wisest one. And real, lasting change does not begin with offense, outrage, or winning debates. It begins with humility. It begins with self-awareness. It begins when we're willing to listen, not just with our ears, but with our hearts. Now, this is the inner room, and this is where growth truly begins within. Until next time, peace and love.